close your eyes for a moment. Imagine standing in the Iraqi desert at twilight, where the ancient city of Uruk once rose from the sands. The wind whispers across dunes that have buried secrets for over 4,000 years. Above you, stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. The same stars that ancient Sumerians watched, the same questions they asked themselves echoing across millennia. Who taught us to write? Who showed us the movements of planets we couldn't possibly see? And who were the Anunnaki? Those mysterious beings the Sumerians called those who from heaven to earth came. Tonight, we're going on a journey through one of humanity's most enduring mysteries, a story that begins in the cradle of civilization and reaches forward to touch our lives today. Whether you're listening to learn something new or simply letting these ancient tales carry you towards sleep, you're exactly where you need to be. Before we begin, if you enjoy these journeys through history's mysteries, a like or subscription helps us create more stories like this. And I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment. I love seeing this community span the globe. Now, let's step back in time to when gods walked among men, and the line between myth and memory was written in clay. Chapter 1. The Desert's Dream. The desert remembers everything. In southern Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers once flowed with abundance, there's a silence that feels almost sacred. The kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat, your own small place in the vast sweep of time. Here, beneath layers of sand and centuries of forgetting, lie the remnants of something extraordinary. The world's first cities, the first written words, the first laws, the first schools, the first libraries. But perhaps most intriguing of all, the first stories about where we came from. If you were to stand in this landscape today, you might see nothing but endless stretches of sand and the occasional crumbling mud brick wall. But close your eyes. Let your imagination peel back the layers. 5,000 years. 6,000. More. Suddenly, the desert blooms. Ziggurats rise like mountains made by human hands, their stepped sides climbing toward the heavens. Canals gleam with water, bringing life to fields of barley and wheat. Markets buzz with the world's first merchants, trading goods that traveled from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean Sea. And everywhere, written on clay tablets, carved into stone, woven into the very fabric of their society. Stories of the Anunnaki. The word itself feels ancient on your tongue. Anunnaki. Try saying it slowly, letting each syllable resonate. Anunnaki. The Sumerians, who first spoke this word 5,000 years ago, felt something when they said it. Reverence, perhaps. Or maybe fear. Possibly gratitude. These were the beings who came before, the ones who taught, who guided, who shaped the very foundation of human civilization. Or so the stories say. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand the Anunnaki, we need to understand the people who remembered them, the people who wrote their names in clay and built temples to reach them. We need to understand the Sumerians and the mystery of how they appeared, seemingly overnight, with knowledge that shouldn't have been possible. Around 4,500 years before the Common Era, something remarkable happened in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia. The word means between rivers in Greek, and it describes perfectly this fertile crescent cradled between the Tigris and Euphrates. But the Greeks wouldn't name it for thousands of years yet. When our story begins, this land belonged to a people we now call Sumerians. Though what they called themselves remains one of history's small mysteries. They referred to their land as Ki-on-Gir, which scholars believe meant the land of civilized lords. And civilized they were. Extraordinarily so. Imagine you're an archaeologist in the 1800s, digging in the Iraqi desert. You're expecting to find perhaps some primitive settlements, maybe some crude pottery. Instead, your shovel strikes something hard. You brush away the sand, and there, a clay tablet covered in strange wedge-shaped marks. Cuneiform, we call it now, from the Latin word for wedge. You keep digging. More tablets. Dozens. Hundreds. Thousands. And as scholars begin to translate these tablets over the following decades, a picture emerges that stuns the academic world. This wasn't a primitive people slowly learning to farm and build. This was a sophisticated civilization that appeared almost fully formed, with complex systems already in place. They had cities, not just villages or towns, but actual cities with populations in the tens of thousands. Uruk, at its height, may have housed 50,000 people in 3000 BCE. To put that in perspective, most of Europe wouldn't see cities that large for another 3,000 years. They had writing, not simple pictographs, but a complete writing system capable of expressing complex ideas, keeping detailed records, writing poetry, and philosophy and law. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving stories, comes from Sumeria. They were writing literature when most of the world was still pre-literate. They had mathematics. The Sumerians used a base 60 number system, and we still use their legacy today. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Every time you check your watch, you're using Sumerian math. They had astronomy. Sumerian star charts show a sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. They tracked the movements of planets, predicted eclipses, and divided the sky into constellations we still recognize today. The zodiac. That's a Sumerian invention, refined later by the Babylonians. They had law. The Code of Hammurabi is famous, but it came later, building on earlier Sumerian legal traditions. The Sumerians understood contracts, property rights, inheritance, and justice. They had courts and judges and a concept of written law that protected both the powerful and the weak. They had irrigation engineering that wouldn't be matched for millennia. They had medicine, including surgical procedures. They had schools where young scribes learned to read and write. They had a concept of time that included hours, days, months, and years. They brewed beer, produced textiles, worked with bronze and copper and gold. This wasn't a society slowly evolving from hunter-gatherers. This was a civilization that seemed to arrive with an instruction manual. And that's where things get interesting. The Sumerians themselves had an answer for where all this knowledge came from. It's written in their oldest texts, repeated in their myths, carved into their temple walls. They didn't claim to have figured it all out themselves through generations of trial and error. They said they were taught by the Anunnaki. Now, before we go further, let's be clear about what we know for certain and what remains in the realm of mystery and interpretation. The word Anunnaki appears throughout Sumerian texts. That's a fact. These texts describe the Anunnaki as powerful beings who came from above, who possessed great knowledge, and who played a crucial role in the development of human civilization. That's also a fact, at least in terms of what the texts say. What the Anunnaki actually were. That's where the story splits into different paths, different interpretations, different possibilities. In the Sumerian worldview, the Anunnaki were divine beings, though not quite in the way we might think of gods today. They weren't abstract, distant forces. They were present, active, involved in the daily affairs of humans. The texts describe them as having needs, emotions, conflicts. They ate and drank. They loved and fought. They made decisions that affected humanity, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill. The name itself is telling. Anunnaki can be broken down in Sumerian. Anu was the sky god, the father of the gods. Na means of or from, and Ki means earth. So Anunnaki, very literally, means those of Anu who are on earth, or those who from heaven to earth came. Think about that phrase for a moment. Those who from heaven to earth came. It appears over and over in Sumerian texts. Not metaphorically, not poetically, but stated as what seems to be historical fact, as matter-of-factly as you might say, those who from England to America came. The Sumerians described a time before the Anunnaki arrived, when humans existed but lived primitively, without the knowledge of civilization. Then the Anunnaki came, and everything changed. They taught humans agriculture. They taught writing and mathematics. They established the first cities and showed humans how to govern themselves. They gave humanity the gifts of civilization. In return, the humans served them, built temples for them, offered sacrifices, maintained the cities and farms. It was a relationship, complex and multifaceted, between those who taught and those who learned. But here's what makes this story so endlessly fascinating, so worthy of our contemplation tonight as we drift between waking and dreaming. Every civilization has stories about beings who came from above and taught humanity the arts of civilization. The ancient Greeks had Prometheus, who gave humans fire and knowledge. The Egyptians spoke of the gods who ruled during the first time, when the foundations of their culture were laid. In Central America, the Mayans and Aztecs told of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who brought knowledge from the sky. In the Pacific, Polynesian cultures spoke of gods who came from beyond the horizon. The stories are everywhere, always the same basic pattern: beings from somewhere else. Sky, sea, beyond the mountains, bringing knowledge, teaching, guiding, then leaving, with promises to return. Are these just stories? Myths created by ancient peoples trying to explain their own development, projecting their achievements onto imagined divine benefactors? That's certainly possible. Humans have always created myths to explain what we don't understand. Or could these stories be something else? Memories, perhaps distorted by time and retelling, of something that actually happened. Not necessarily in the literal way the stories describe, but some kernel of truth at their heart. The Sumerians didn't think they were writing mythology. When they pressed their styluses into wet clay, creating those wedge-shaped marks we call cuneiform, they thought they were recording history. The history of their gods, yes, but history nonetheless. These tablets weren't found in temples only. They were in libraries, in government buildings, in schools. They were teaching texts, historical records, administrative documents. They believed the Anunnaki were real, not metaphors, not symbols. Real beings who had really come, really taught, really shaped their world. And so we arrive at the central question that will guide us through this night's journey. What were the Anunnaki? Were they gods in the way the Sumerians believed? Were they, as some modern researchers suggest, visitors from beyond Earth, their advanced technology seeming like magic to primitive humans? Were they simply the Sumerians' way of explaining natural phenomena and their own cultural development? Or is there another answer? Something we haven't yet considered. We don't need to answer that question tonight. In fact, the beauty of this mystery is that we can't definitively answer it. What we can do is explore. Look at the evidence, consider the possibilities, and let ourselves wonder, because wonder is where all good stories begin. The Sumerian desert is dark now, in our imagination. The stars wheel overhead, the same stars that guided Sumerian astronomers, the same stars they believed were home to the Anunnaki. Tomorrow, the sun will rise over the ruins again, as it has for thousands of years. The clay tablets sleep in museums, their words waiting to be read again. And somewhere in the human heart, the questions persist. Where did we come from? Who taught us? Are we alone? The Sumerians thought they knew the answers. They wrote them down, preserved them in clay, passed them down through generations. And now, separated by 5,000 years and half a world, we read their words and wonder if they might have been right. Let's find out what they had to say. Chapter 2: The Gods and Their Myths. In the beginning, according to the Sumerians, there was only the primordial sea. Namu, the ancient mother who existed before time, had a name. From her emerged An, the sky, and Ki, the earth. And when sky and earth separated, when that first breath of space opened between them, the stage was set for everything that would follow. This is how the Sumerians understood creation. Not as a single act by a single god, but as a process, a family tree of divine beings, each with their own domain, their own personality, their own role to play in the cosmic drama. And at the center of this divine family, ruling from the highest heaven, was Anu. Anu. Even his name feels vast. It's short, simple, just 2 syllables, yet it contains within it the concept of everything above. The dome of heaven, the realm of stars, the place from which all authority flows. When the Sumerians looked up at the night sky, they weren't just seeing distant lights. They were looking at Anu's domain, the seat of ultimate power in the universe. Anu rarely came to earth in the stories. He was too exalted, too removed from the daily concerns of mortals, and even of the other gods. He stayed in his celestial palace, attended by stars as servants, dispensing judgments and maintaining the cosmic order. When other gods needed a final decision, a ultimate authority, they journeyed upward to Anu's court. His word was law, not just for humans, but for all beings, divine or otherwise. Think of him not as a god in the way we often imagine gods today. Not as someone who answers prayers or intervenes in personal matters. Think of him instead as the principle of order itself, the idea that the universe has structure, rules, a hierarchy that must be maintained. Anu represented the belief that chaos could be held at bay, that there was a right way for things to be, and that someone, somewhere, was ensuring that right way prevailed. His symbol was a star, or sometimes a horned crown. The Sumerians believed that kings ruled by Anu's authority. When a new king took the throne, he was said to receive the kingship lowered from heaven, from Anu himself. Every law, every judgment, every exercise of royal power traced its legitimacy back to Anu's distant but absolute authority. But Anu, for all his power, is not the god we'll spend most of our time with tonight. Because Anu, like many ultimate authorities, delegated. He had children, divine offspring who were closer to Earth, more involved in the messy business of running a world and dealing with humans. And chief among these was Enlil. Enlil, whose name means Lord Wind or Lord Storm. If Anu was the distant principle of order, Enlil was its active enforcement. He was the executor of divine will, the administrator of heaven and earth, the god who made things happen. When the Anunnaki Council made a decision, it was Enlil who carried it out. When humanity needed to be guided or corrected, Enlil was the one who acted. The ancient texts describe Enlil's domain as the space between heaven and earth, the atmosphere, the realm of weather and wind and storm. He controlled the forces that brought rain for crops or devastating floods. He could speak with the voice of thunder or the gentle whisper of a favorable breeze. In a land like Mesopotamia, where agriculture depended entirely on carefully managed water and favorable weather, Enlil's power was not abstract. It was life and death, but Enlil was complex, like all the Anunnaki. The texts don't paint him as simply good or evil, benevolent or cruel. He was stern, just, often harsh, but ultimately concerned with maintaining order and ensuring that the natural laws were followed. One of the most famous stories about Enlil comes from the Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest Mesopotamian texts we possess. The story goes like this. Humanity had multiplied greatly upon the earth. The cities were crowded. Noise filled the air day and night. And this noise, this constant clamour of human activity, disturbed Enlil's rest. Now, you might think this sounds petty, a god annoyed by noise. But consider what this story might really be saying. Perhaps it's not about literal noise, but about humanity growing beyond the bounds that had been set for them, becoming too numerous, too independent, too difficult to manage. Or perhaps, more darkly, it's about the powerful finding any excuse to reassert control when those beneath them grow too comfortable, too self-assured. Whatever the true meaning, Enlil's solution was drastic. He decided to send a great flood to wipe out humanity and start fresh. The Anunnaki Council agreed, though not unanimously, and Enlil commanded that no god should warn the humans of what was coming. Let them be swept away. Let silence return to the earth. This is the great flood story you've probably heard before, though perhaps in a different version. Because this Sumerian story, written down over 4,000 years ago, is clearly the ancestor of the biblical flood narrative. Noah's Ark, the 40 days and nights of rain, the saving of the animals. All of these elements exist first in the much older Sumerian tales. But there's a crucial difference. In the Sumerian version, Enlil is not the only god, and not all the gods agreed with his decision. One in particular saw things differently. One who would become, in many ways, humanity's greatest divine advocate. Enki. If Enlil was the stern administrator, Enki was the clever craftsman. If Enlil represented the letter of the law, Enki represented creative solutions and compassionate wisdom. His name means Lord of the Earth, and his domain was the fresh waters beneath the earth, the Abzu, the source of rivers and springs and all life-giving water. While Enlil controlled the sky, Enki controlled what flowed beneath, what nurtured and sustained. The contrast between the two brothers, and yes, they were brothers in the divine family tree, is one of the most fascinating elements of Sumerian mythology. They represented two different approaches to the problem of existence, two different philosophies about how the universe should work. Enlil believed in order maintained through strength and authority. Rules must be followed. Those who break them must face consequences. The system must be preserved, even if individuals suffer. Enki believed in wisdom, in finding ways around impossible situations, in valuing creativity and life over rigid adherence to rules. He was the problem solver, the inventor, the one who asked, but what if we tried something different? And when Enlil decided to destroy humanity with a flood, Enki couldn't stand by and let it happen. Now, Enki had made a promise to the other gods not to warn humans directly. He'd given his word, and even Enki, the trickster god, couldn't simply break that oath. So he found a loophole. Instead of speaking directly to a human, he spoke to a wall. Specifically, the reed wall of a house where a man named Ziusudra slept. Reed wall, Enki whispered. Listen to my words. A flood is coming. Build a boat. Save yourself, your family, and the seed of all living things. Was Enki really talking to the wall? Of course not. He knew Ziusudra could hear him on the other side. But technically, he hadn't broken his promise. He hadn't spoken to a human directly. This is classic Enki. Respecting the letter of the law while completely violating its spirit, and doing so to save lives. Ziusudra, or Utnapishtim in the later Babylonian version, or Noah in the biblical tradition, built his boat. He gathered his family and animals. And when the flood came, when the rain fell for 7 days and 7 nights, when the waters rose and covered the earth, when all of humanity perished except for those on the boat, Ziusudra survived. Eventually, the waters receded. Ziusudra made offerings to the gods, and Enlil, seeing that someone had survived, was furious. Who had betrayed his plan? But Enki stepped forward, not to apologize, but to argue his case. Was it right to destroy all of humanity for the sins of some? Wasn't there value in mercy, in second chances? Couldn't there be a better way? And something remarkable happened. Enlil listened. The stern administrator, the enforcer of divine law, actually considered Enki's argument. And in the end, he relented. Humanity would be allowed to continue, though with new limitations. They would be mortal now, truly mortal, with lifespans measured in decades rather than centuries. They would face hardship and struggle, but they would live. This story tells us something profound about how the Sumerians understood their gods. These weren't perfect, omniscient beings. They made mistakes. They had disagreements. They could be convinced to change their minds. They were powerful, yes, immensely so, but they were also, well, human, in many ways. They had emotions, made rash decisions, experienced regret. And among all of them, Enki stood out as the one who seemed to genuinely care about humanity's welfare. The texts describe Enki as the creator of humans in some versions of the creation story. Working with the mother goddess Ninhursag, he fashioned humans from clay mixed with the blood of a sacrificed god. This wasn't a simple act of pottery. It was genetic engineering, in a sense. Mixing the divine essence with earthly matter to create something new. Something that could think and work, that could learn and build, but that was ultimately mortal, bound to the earth. Why create humans at all? The Sumerian texts are surprisingly direct about this. The gods needed workers. Specifically, the younger gods, the Igigi, were tired of doing all the labor of maintaining creation. Mining, farming, building. It was exhausting. So the senior Anunnaki decided to create a new type of being. Something intelligent enough to do complex work, but without the power or immortality of the gods themselves. Humans were created to serve. It's stated plainly in multiple texts. We were the workers, the servants of the gods. And the gods, in return, would provide for us, protect us, teach us. It's a transactional relationship, when you think about it. Not the loving father-child relationship of later monotheistic religions, more like an employer and employee, or perhaps a lord and vassal. The gods gave us civilization, knowledge, the tools to thrive. We gave them labor, worship, offerings. But within that framework, some gods were better employers than others. And Enki seemed to actually care. When humans needed help, Enki often provided it. When we faced destruction, Enki found ways to save us. When we lacked knowledge, Enki taught us, even when other gods thought we shouldn't be taught. There's a story about Enki giving humanity the me, a Sumerian concept that's hard to translate directly. The me was something like the fundamental principles of civilization, not just tools or techniques, but the deeper concepts that make civilization possible. Things like kingship, priesthood, law, music, art, wisdom, craftsmanship. The me were kept in Enki's temple in the city of Eridu, the oldest city in Sumerian tradition. In one famous tale, the goddess Inanna traveled to Eridu and got Enki drunk on beer. While he was intoxicated, she convinced him to give her some of the me, which she then took back to her own city, Uruk. When Enki sobered up and realized what he'd done, he tried to get them back, but Inanna had already distributed them among humanity. The gifts couldn't be taken back. Whether this story is literal or metaphorical, well, that's one of those questions we'll keep returning to. But either way, it tells us something important. Knowledge, once given, can't be taken away. The me, the principles of civilization, once shared with humanity, became ours. The gods, or at least some of them, had made humans more than simple workers. They'd made us capable of creating our own civilizations. But the Anunnaki family tree extended far beyond just Anu, Enlil, and Enki. The tablets list dozens of major deities and hundreds of minor ones. Each had their domains, their cities, their temples, their worshippers. There was Ninhursag, the mother goddess, associated with birth and nature. She worked with Enki in the creation of humans and was revered as the mother of all living things. There was Inanna, later known as Ishtar to the Babylonians, goddess of love and beauty, but also of war. One of the most complex deities in the Mesopotamian pantheon, Inanna was fierce and passionate, capable of great creation and terrible destruction. Her symbol was the eight-pointed star, and her famous descent to the underworld is one of the oldest recorded myths we have. There was Nanna, the moon god, who measured time and whose cycles governed the Sumerian calendar. His city was Ur, one of the most important cities in ancient Mesopotamia. There was Utu, the sun god, associated with justice and truth. Nothing could be hidden from Utu's all-seeing light. He witnessed oaths and punished those who broke them. There was Marduk, who would later become the supreme god of Babylon, eclipsing even Anu and Enlil in importance. His rise to power reflected the political rise of Babylon itself, a reminder that these gods were intimately connected to the cities and peoples who worshipped them. And there was Ninurta, the warrior god, the fighter who protected civilization from the forces of chaos. His exploits in battle were celebrated in numerous texts, and kings often claimed to be fighting under his banner. Each of these gods had temples in specific cities. Each city had its patron deity, and the fortunes of the city were believed to be tied to their god's favor. When a city prospered, it was because their god was powerful and pleased. When a city fell to enemies, it was because their god had been defeated or had withdrawn protection. This creates a fascinating picture when you step back and look at it. The Anunnaki weren't a unified, peaceful family. They competed for power and influence. They formed alliances and rivalries. They fought wars through their human worshippers. The politics of heaven mirrored the politics of earth. Or perhaps it was the other way around. Some scholars see this as evidence that the gods were simply projections of human society. We created gods that acted like we did because we made them in our image. That's certainly a reasonable interpretation, but here's another way to look at it. What if the Sumerians were describing a real power structure, but in the only language and concepts they had available? What if there really were powerful beings, whether divine or otherwise, who had their own conflicts and alliances. What if humanity really was caught in the middle of larger forces competing for control? The texts describe councils of the gods, meetings where decisions about humanity's fate were made. They describe conflicts between divine beings, solved through negotiation, or sometimes through force. They describe a hierarchy with Anu at the top, Enlil as the executive, and various other gods with specific portfolios and responsibilities. It's eerily similar to how we might describe a government or a large organization. There's a clear chain of command. Departments with specific functions, internal politics and power struggles, treaties and agreements between different factions. If you were a primitive human trying to describe an advanced civilization, whether from the stars or from some other source, might you describe it exactly like this? As gods with different powers and responsibilities, forming councils, making decisions that affected your life? Or is that giving too much credit to a theory with no hard evidence? Are we seeing patterns that aren't really there, finding hidden meanings in simple myths? These are the questions that keep us awake at night. Or in this case, that we contemplate as we drift towards sleep. Because there's something deeply satisfying about not knowing, about being able to wonder. The moment we think we have all the answers is the moment we stop really looking at the questions. What we know for certain is this: the Sumerians believed in the Anunnaki. They built massive temples to honor them. They devoted enormous resources to maintaining these temples, feeding the temple staff, performing daily rituals. They wrote down the stories of these gods with careful attention to detail. They passed these stories down through generations, teaching them in schools, reciting them at festivals, incorporating them into their laws and their understanding of the world. This wasn't casual mythology. This was the foundation of their entire civilization. The Anunnaki weren't abstract concepts. They were present, active forces in Sumerian life. Every king claimed to rule by their authority. Every law was supposedly derived from divine precedent. Every major decision involved consulting the gods through priests and omens. And here's what's truly remarkable. This system worked. Sumerian civilization lasted for over 1,000 years. It gave rise to achievements in art, literature, architecture, and science that wouldn't be matched for millennia. Whatever the Sumerians believed about the Anunnaki, whatever relationship they thought they had with these divine beings, it resulted in one of the most successful and influential civilizations in human history. Every time you write something down, you're using a gift the Sumerians first developed. Every time you divide an hour into minutes and seconds, you're using their mathematics. Every time you read a story about a great flood, or a hero's journey, or the conflict between order and chaos, you're encountering themes the Sumerians explored 5,000 years ago. They built their civilization on the foundation of their relationship with the Anunnaki. And that civilization, even in ruins, still shapes our world today. So were the Anunnaki real? Were they gods? Were they something else entirely? Or were they the Sumerians' way of understanding and organizing their own collective wisdom and achievement? Let's keep exploring. Because the story is far from over. We've met the major players in the divine drama. Now let's look at what they supposedly did, the gifts they gave, the knowledge they shared, the fingerprints they left on human civilization that still intrigue us thousands of years later. The night is deep now. The stars wheel overhead, and in the space between waking and sleeping, between knowing and wondering, the ancient stories wait to unfold. Chapter 3: The Anunnaki's Hand in Building Civilization. There's a moment that every archaeologist dreams of. That instant when the brush sweeps away the last bit of dust, when the artifact emerges into light for the first time in millennia, when you realize you're holding something that changes everything you thought you knew. For modern scholars studying ancient Sumeria, that moment has happened over and over again. Each discovery more puzzling than the last. Each tablet more sophisticated than it should be. Each piece of evidence suggesting that the Sumerians knew things they had no business knowing. Let's start with something simple. Numbers. You use Sumerian mathematics every single day of your life. When you check the time and see 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, that's Sumerian. When you navigate using degrees, 360 of them in a circle, that's Sumerian. When you buy eggs by the dozen, or refer to a gross as 12 dozen. You're using Sumerian base 60 mathematics, which divides beautifully by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. Most ancient cultures used base 10 counting. It's natural. We have 10 fingers, after all. The Egyptians used base 10. The Romans used base 10. Even today, our entire numbering system is base 10. But the Sumerians looked at base 10 and apparently thought, that's cute, but we can do better. They developed base 60, which is mathematically superior for division and astronomical calculations. But here's the question that nags at scholars. Why? How did they know base 60 would be more useful? Did they figure it out through trial and error? Or did someone teach them? The Anunnaki, the tablets tell us, gave humanity the gift of numbers. Enki, specifically, is credited with teaching mathematics and measurement. And when you look at how suddenly and completely formed Sumerian mathematics appears in the archaeological record, it does seem almost like a gift. There's no long period of development, no evidence of them slowly figuring things out. One moment there's nothing, the next moment there's a complete mathematical system. But numbers were just the beginning. The Sumerians mapped the stars with an accuracy that seems impossible for their era. They identified constellations that we still use today. The zodiac. Aries, Taurus, Gemini, and the rest. That's a Sumerian invention, later adopted by the Babylonians, Greeks, and eventually the entire world. They tracked the movements of planets across the night sky. They predicted eclipses. They understood that the Earth rotated and that this rotation created the appearance of stars moving across the sky. Here's where it gets really interesting. The Sumerians knew about planets that can't be seen with the naked eye. Their texts refer to our solar system in ways that suggest they understood it as a system, with the sun at the center, not the Earth. They describe planets in an order that matches reality, including planets that wouldn't be officially discovered until the invention of the telescope thousands of years later. How did they know? The standard answer is that they didn't. Not really. That we're misinterpreting the texts, seeing things that aren't there. That the Sumerians were talking about something else entirely, and modern researchers with modern knowledge are projecting our understanding onto their words. Maybe that's true. Translation is tricky, especially with a dead language. The Sumerian word we translate as planet might have meant something different to them. Context can be lost across 5,000 years. But then you look at the star charts themselves, inscribed in stone and clay. You see the precision, the careful tracking of celestial movements, the mathematical calculations required to predict astronomical events. And you wonder. You can't help but wonder. The Sumerians said Anu ruled the heavens, that his domain was the stars. They said the Anunnaki came from the sky. They built their ziggurats, those massive stepped pyramids. As mountains reaching toward the heavens, stairways between earth and sky. The word ziggurat itself means to build high. These weren't just temples. They were astronomical observatories, carefully aligned with celestial events. When you stand at the ruins of a ziggurat today, even crumbled by time, you can still sense the ambition behind them, the desire to reach upward, to connect with something vast and distant. The ancient priests would climb to the top platforms, closer to the realm of the gods, and there they would watch the stars, tracking movements, recording patterns, searching for meaning in the wheeling cosmos. And they found meaning. Or at least, they found patterns. The Sumerian astronomical texts are filled with precise observations. They tracked Venus with particular care. The bright morning and evening star, which they associated with Inanna. They knew Venus's cycle, understood that the morning star and evening star were the same celestial body. They calculated its movements years in advance. This required mathematics. Complex mathematics, the kind that astronomers use today, and the Sumerians had it 5,000 years ago, inscribed on clay tablets that would bake hard in the Mesopotamian sun and survive to puzzle us today. They also had something else, something that, when it was first discovered, sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. They had lists, detailed, comprehensive lists of astronomical data going back thousands of years before their civilization officially existed. These are called the astronomical diaries. tablets recording the positions of planets, the timing of eclipses, the movements of stars, not just from the time the tablet was written, but backwards into what the Sumerians called the time before the flood. Records that claim to span tens of thousands of years. Now, the conservative explanation is that these were mythological, that the Sumerians were inventing astronomical data for the distant past to give their civilization an air of ancient authority. That's possible. Plenty of cultures have invented noble ancestors and mythical golden ages. But some of the data is accurate, verifiably accurate, astronomical events that really did happen in the distant past, recorded with precision. How did they know? How did they calculate backwards with such accuracy? The texts say the Anunnaki taught them, that Enki and Anu shared the knowledge of the heavens with humanity, that what the Sumerians knew about the stars wasn't discovered through long observation, but given as a gift, a download of information from those who already possessed it. Is that what really happened? Or is it the Sumerians' way of explaining their own remarkable achievements, attributing their genius to divine instruction because they couldn't imagine humans figuring it out alone? Let's move from the heavens to the earth. To water, Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, was fertile but challenging. The Tigris and Euphrates flooded unpredictably. Too much water could destroy crops. Too little, and everything withered. Success in this landscape required mastery over water, and the Sumerians mastered it. Their irrigation systems were engineering marvels. Complex networks of canals, reservoirs, and gates that controlled water flow with precision. They understood hydraulics, knew how to calculate water pressure and flow rates. They built aqueducts and dams. They drained swamps and created farmland where none existed before. The city of Eridu, according to Sumerian tradition, was the first city ever built. It was Enki's city, and Enki was the god of water, specifically of the Abzu, the fresh water beneath the earth. The texts say Enki chose this location and taught the first humans how to dig wells, how to tap into the deep water, how to bring life to the desert. When archaeologists excavated Eridu, they found evidence of continuous habitation going back to around 5500 BCE. The earliest levels show a simple settlement, but within a relatively short time, a few centuries, that settlement transformed into a sophisticated city with complex water management systems already in place. The transition is remarkably abrupt, as if someone who already knew how to do these things arrived and showed the inhabitants, as if they were taught. That phrase keeps coming up, doesn't it? As if they were taught, as if knowledge came from outside, rather than developing organically from within. But perhaps that's not fair. Perhaps the Sumerians were simply brilliant engineers who figured things out through experimentation and inherited some knowledge from earlier cultures we haven't discovered yet. The archaeological record is incomplete. There could be missing pieces that would make the picture clearer. And yet, the Sumerians also had medical knowledge that seems advanced for their time. Texts describe surgical procedures, the use of antiseptics, understanding of anatomy, herbal remedies that modern science has confirmed actually work. They knew about the healing properties of willow bark, which contains the same active ingredient as aspirin. They understood that cleanliness prevented infection. They set broken bones with splints designed to hold the bone in proper alignment during healing. Who figured all this out? How many people died in trial and error before they learned what worked? Or did someone who already knew share that knowledge, saving countless lives in the process? The tablets say the goddess Ninisina was the divine physician, the one who knew the secrets of healing, that she taught these secrets to certain chosen humans who became the first doctors. That medical knowledge was another gift from the Anunnaki, not something humans had to discover entirely on their own. Let's talk about something even more fundamental: writing itself. Writing is one of humanity's most important inventions. It allows knowledge to be preserved, shared across distances, passed down through generations. Everything we know about the ancient world, we know because someone wrote it down. The Sumerians invented writing around 3200 BCE. Or at least, that's the oldest writing we found. It starts as simple pictographs. Pictures representing objects or ideas. A circle with rays for sun. A bundle of reeds for house. Straightforward, logical. But here's what's strange. Within just a few generations, Those simple pictographs evolved into cuneiform, a complete writing system capable of expressing abstract concepts, complex grammar, poetry, philosophy. The evolution happened so quickly. Too quickly, some scholars argue, for natural development. The Sumerian creation myths describe writing as a gift from the gods, specifically from Nabu, the god of wisdom and writing, who was associated with Enki, the power to capture thoughts in physical form, to make words permanent, to speak across time. This wasn't presented as a human invention. It was described as divine knowledge shared with humanity. And once the Sumerians had writing, they wrote everything. Administrative records, yes. Trade inventories and tax receipts, but also literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's first great work of literature, comes from this tradition. Stories of the gods, philosophical treatises, love poems, lamentations, proverbs, school exercises. They built libraries, the first libraries in human history. Rooms filled with clay tablets, organized by subject, catalogued, preserved. The House of Wisdom in Babylon, much later, would become legendary, but the tradition started in Sumeria. Knowledge was valuable. Knowledge was power. And knowledge had to be preserved. The tablets themselves are remarkable objects. Clay, pressed with a stylus, creating those distinctive wedge shapes, then dried or baked, becoming nearly indestructible. While paper crumbles and parchment rots, clay tablets endure, which means we have thousands upon thousands of them, spanning the entire history of Mesopotamian civilization. Primary sources, written by people who were there, telling us what they thought, what they believed, what they knew. And what they knew was extensive. Medical texts, mathematical tables, astronomical observations, legal codes, business contracts, school lessons, literary works, religious texts, administrative records, personal letters, shopping lists, even the full spectrum of human life, written down and preserved. One of the most fascinating categories is the omen texts. The Sumerians and Babylonians believed that the gods communicated through signs. The flight of birds, the patterns of smoke, the markings on a sacrificed animal's liver, and they kept detailed records of what signs meant what. Thousands of tablets listing omens and their interpretations. This might seem like superstition to us, and perhaps it was. But consider this. The omen texts represent a systematic attempt to understand patterns, to predict outcomes based on observed phenomena. It's proto-science, really. The method was flawed, but the impulse to observe, record, analyze, and predict. That's the scientific impulse. The Sumerians were trying to understand how the world worked. They were looking for patterns, for causes and effects. They believed the gods controlled these patterns, but they also believed the patterns could be understood, learned, used to make better decisions. When a king needed to decide whether to go to war, he would consult the omens. This wasn't blind faith. It was an attempt to gather information, to reduce uncertainty, to make an informed decision. The fact that they were reading sheep livers instead of satellite intelligence doesn't change the underlying logic. And the Anunnaki, according to the texts, taught humanity how to read the omens, how to understand the gods' messages, how to glimpse the future through careful observation of the present. Whether this actually worked? Well, that's another question. But the point is, they believed it worked, and they built systems around that belief. Complex, sophisticated systems that required deep knowledge and careful study. Let's consider the legal codes. The Code of Hammurabi is famous. An eye for an eye and all that. But Hammurabi's code, written around 1750 BCE, was building on much earlier Sumerian legal traditions. The Code of Ur-Nammu, from around 2100 BCE, is older and in some ways more sophisticated. It includes provisions for protecting the poor from exploitation by the rich, for ensuring fair weights and measures in trade, for establishing punishments that fit crimes. These weren't simple tribal customs. They were complex legal systems that recognized different categories of people. Free citizens, slaves, foreigners, and established different rights and responsibilities for each. They understood property rights, inheritance, contracts, personal injury, criminal justice. Where did these concepts come from? The texts say the gods established the first laws, that Utu, the sun god, embodied justice, and that kings received their legal authority from him. That law itself was divine in origin, given to humanity so we could live in organized societies rather than chaos. Again, we can interpret this as mythology. Humans developed law because we needed it to live together in large groups. We attributed it to gods because that gave it authority and permanence. That's a perfectly reasonable explanation. But the Sumerians didn't experience it that way. They experienced law as something revealed, not invented. As something that existed independent of human whim, that reflected a higher order, that connected earthly justice to cosmic justice. And remarkably, their legal systems worked. They allowed cities of tens of thousands of people to function peacefully. They enabled trade across vast distances. They created stability that lasted for centuries. Everything keeps coming back to the same pattern. The Sumerians had knowledge that seemed to appear suddenly, fully formed. Knowledge that they attributed to the Anunnaki. Knowledge that enabled them to build a civilization of stunning sophistication. Mathematics, astronomy, irrigation, medicine, writing, law. These are the foundations of civilization, and the Sumerians had all of them, implemented at a high level, within a relatively brief period of time. The conventional explanation is that they developed these things themselves, building on earlier, simpler cultures whose remains we haven't fully excavated yet. That what seems sudden to us was actually gradual when you look at the complete picture. That the Sumerians were simply brilliant people who made remarkable progress. That's probably true. Humans are capable of amazing things when we put our minds to it. We don't need divine intervention to explain our achievements. But there's always a but, isn't there? The Sumerians themselves didn't take credit for these achievements. They consistently, repeatedly, across thousands of texts spanning centuries, attributed their knowledge to the Anunnaki. They described these beings as teachers, as givers of civilization's gifts. They built massive temples to honor them, devoted enormous resources to maintaining these temples, structured their entire society around serving and pleasing these divine benefactors. Why? If the Sumerians developed all this knowledge themselves through their own brilliance and hard work, why give credit to imaginary gods? You might say it's just how ancient people thought. They didn't have the concept of human progress. They assumed that anything good must come from the gods. They lacked our modern understanding of how knowledge accumulates over generations. Maybe. But the Sumerians weren't simple people. They were sophisticated thinkers who wrote complex literature exploring human nature, morality, the meaning of life. They understood causation. They kept detailed records of their history. They honored their great kings and leaders by name, celebrated their achievements, built monuments to their accomplishments. They knew humans could do things. They recognized human agency and achievement. So when they said the Anunnaki gave them civilization's gifts, were they really just being modest? Or were they recording something they believed actually happened? There's a text called the Sumerian King List. It's a chronological listing of all the kings who ruled in Sumeria, starting from the very beginning. And it divides history into two eras, before the flood and after the flood. The kings who ruled before the flood had impossibly long reigns. One ruled for 43,000 years, another for 36,000. These numbers are clearly mythological. No human lives that long. But interestingly, after the flood, the reign lengths become progressively more realistic. A few thousand years, then a few hundred, then eventually numbers that seem almost plausible. It's as if the king list is describing a transition, from a time when beings who weren't quite human ruled, to a time when humans who were partly divine ruled, to a time when ordinary humans ruled with the gods' blessing. From the age of the Anunnaki, to the age of hero kings like Gilgamesh, to the historical age, the text presents this as a continuous history, not as mythology giving way to history, but as one unbroken timeline where the nature of rulers changed, but the kingdom continued. What are we supposed to make of that? One interpretation: it's pure mythology. The Sumerians invented ancient kings with impossibly long reigns to give their civilization antiquity and prestige. The flood story marks the transition from mythical time to historical time. It's a literary device, not meant to be taken literally. Another interpretation: the long reign times are symbolic. They represent dynasties or eras, not individual rulers. The king list is attempting to preserve a memory of extremely ancient times, but the details have become garbled and exaggerated in the retelling. A third interpretation, more controversial: the king list is describing actual beings who lived much longer than humans do. The Anunnaki themselves, or their offspring with humans, who ruled in the distant past. The flood represents a cataclysm that ended that era and ushered in the age of purely human rulers. Which interpretation is correct? We don't know. We can't know. Not with certainty. The evidence is ambiguous enough to support multiple theories. But here's what we do know. The Sumerians took this seriously. The king list wasn't a fairy tale. It was an official document, copied and preserved, taught in schools. It was considered history, not fiction. And the Anunnaki are all through it. Present at the beginning, guiding human development, teaching the arts of civilization, until the flood came and changed everything, pushing them into the background, leaving humans to carry on what had been started. The deeper you dig into Sumerian texts, the more consistent the story becomes. The details vary from tablet to tablet. Names change. Specific events differ, but the overall narrative remains the same. Powerful beings called the Anunnaki came from above. They established cities. They taught humans. They gave us the tools of civilization. Then they gradually withdrew, leaving us to govern ourselves, though they still watched from their temples, still received worship, still occasionally intervened in human affairs. It's a coherent narrative. It explains the sudden flowering of Sumerian civilization. It accounts for the sophisticated knowledge that seems to appear from nowhere. It gives meaning to the temples and rituals and social structures that defined Mesopotamian society for thousands of years. Is it true? That's the question that echoes through the ages. Is it true? Or more precisely, what kind of truth is it? Historical truth? Metaphorical truth? Psychological truth? Some combination we don't quite have words for. The Sumerians believed it was true. They staked their civilization on it. And their civilization thrived for over 1,000 years, leaving a legacy that shaped every culture that came after. Sometimes the truth of a story isn't about whether the events literally happened. It's about what the story reveals about the people who told it, what it enabled them to achieve, what it taught them about themselves and their place in the cosmos. The story of the Anunnaki gave the Sumerians a framework for understanding their world. It explained where their knowledge came from. It justified their social structure. It gave them confidence that they were part of something larger, connected to forces beyond themselves. And whether those forces were gods from heaven or simply the accumulated wisdom of their ancestors, crystallized into divine forms. Maybe that distinction matters less than we think. Maybe what matters is what they did with the story, how they used it to build something remarkable that still echoes in our own time. The stars wheel overhead. The ancient cities sleep beneath the sand. The clay tablets rest in museums, their wedge-shaped marks still clear, still speaking across 5 millennia. And the question remains, hanging in the night air like the Sumerians' prayers once did: where did it all come from? Who taught humanity to be civilized? Were the Anunnaki real? Or is asking whether they were real missing the point entirely? Chapter 4: Contemporary Theories and Controversies. In 1976, a book appeared that would change how millions of people thought about ancient history. Its author was Zecharia Sitchin, a journalist and self-taught scholar of ancient languages. Its title was The 12th Planet, and its central claim was audacious, almost unbelievable. The Anunnaki, Sitchin argued, were not gods. They were extraterrestrials. Visitors from another planet in our solar system, a planet the Sumerians called Nibiru, which Sitchin claimed had a long, elliptical orbit that brought it into the inner solar system every 3,600 years. These beings came to Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago, Sitchin said. They came looking for gold, which they needed for some technological purpose. And when the work of mining became too arduous for them, they genetically engineered a worker species by combining their own DNA with that of primitive hominids already living on Earth. That worker species was us, Homo sapiens. We are, according to Sitchin's interpretation, literally the children of the Anunnaki, created beings, designed for a purpose. It's a stunning theory. Science fiction made real. Ancient astronauts walking among primitive humans, advanced technology mistaken for divine power. It would explain everything. The sudden flowering of Sumerian civilization, the sophisticated knowledge they possessed, the stories of gods descending from heaven. If the Anunnaki were real, physical beings with advanced technology, then the Sumerian texts weren't mythology at all. They were history. Eyewitness accounts of actual events, recorded as accurately as the observers could manage with the concepts and language available to them. Sitchin's work became enormously popular. It spawned an entire genre of ancient astronaut theories. It influenced countless books, television shows, movies. The idea that humanity was visited and influenced by extraterrestrial beings in the distant past captured imaginations around the world. It still does. Walk into any bookstore, and you'll find shelves of books exploring variations on this theme. Why? What makes this idea so compelling? Perhaps because it offers answers. Clear, definite answers to questions that have puzzled us for generations. How did ancient peoples build massive stone structures with such precision? Alien technology. How did they have astronomical knowledge beyond what primitive tools should allow? Alien teachers. Why do so many cultures have similar myths about gods from the sky? Because they're all describing the same visitors. It's satisfying in a way that we don't really know can never be. It transforms mystery into solution. It makes us special. Not just random products of evolution, but designed beings, created by intelligences far greater than ourselves. We're connected to the cosmos in a literal, physical way. We're not alone in the universe. We never were. And for Sitchin, the Sumerian texts were the key to understanding this hidden history. He spent decades studying cuneiform tablets, offering his own translations and interpretations. He argued that mainstream scholars had missed the real meaning, that they were interpreting mythologically what should be understood literally. When the text said the Anunnaki came from the heavens, Sitchin said they meant outer space. When they described the creation of humans from clay mixed with divine blood, he said they were describing genetic engineering. When they listed the Anunnaki's sophisticated knowledge of astronomy and mathematics, he said this was technology, not divine inspiration. Every element of the Sumerian narrative, he argued, made perfect sense once you understood that the gods were actually flesh and blood extraterrestrials with advanced science. He pointed to specific tablets, specific passages, building his case piece by piece. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes the formation of the solar system in ways that Sitchin claimed matched modern astronomy. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes technological marvels that sound like spacecraft and advanced weapons. The texts about the creation of humans describe processes that parallel genetic engineering. And most importantly, Sitchin claimed to have found references to Nibiru, the 12th planet. Counting the sun, moon, and the 9 known planets at the time, plus this hidden world. A planet whose orbit brought it close to Earth periodically, allowing the Anunnaki to travel here, mine their gold, interact with early humans, then return home as their planet swung back out into the outer reaches of the solar system. It's an elegant theory, comprehensive, self-consistent. It accounts for a tremendous amount of data and ties together threads from multiple ancient cultures. There's just one problem. Most scholars who actually study ancient Sumeria think Sitchin got it completely wrong. Not wrong in the sense of having a different interpretation. Wrong in the sense of mistranslating words, misunderstanding grammar, taking phrases out of context, and imposing modern concepts onto ancient texts that meant something entirely different. The scholarly critique of Sitchin's work is thorough, and it must be said, fairly devastating. Experts in Sumerian language point out translation errors throughout his books. Words he claims mean rocket or spacecraft actually mean something far more mundane. Passages he interprets as describing interplanetary travel are actually talking about travels between cities, or metaphorical journeys, or poetic descriptions of divine power. Michael Heiser, a scholar of ancient Semitic languages, wrote an extensive analysis of Sitchin's work. His conclusion was blunt. Sitchin couldn't read Sumerian at an advanced level. The translations were often simply wrong, not interpretations that scholars disagreed with, but actual errors in basic grammar and vocabulary. Other scholars have pointed out that Nibiru, in Sumerian and Babylonian texts, isn't described as a planet at all. It's a term associated with the god Marduk, and in different contexts appears to mean a crossing point, or Jupiter, or a star, or even a place in the heavens rather than a celestial body. The idea of Nibiru as a planet with a 3,600-year orbit doesn't appear in the ancient texts. Sitchin imposed that interpretation based on his theory, not derived it from careful reading. Astronomically, the idea of such a planet faces serious problems. An orbit that elliptical would be extremely unstable. If such a planet existed and passed through the inner solar system every few thousand years, it would gravitationally disrupt the orbits of other planets. We would see evidence of this. We don't. Moreover, we've mapped the outer solar system fairly thoroughly now. There's no planet-sized body on the kind of orbit Sitchin described. Could there be a planet we haven't detected yet? Sure. There's ongoing research into a possible planet 9 in the outer solar system, but that hypothetical planet, if it exists, is nothing like what Sitchin described. It would never come close to Earth. It would orbit in the far reaches beyond Neptune, taking thousands of years to complete a single orbit. The genetic engineering aspect of Sitchin's theory also faces problems. Modern genetics has allowed us to trace human evolution with considerable precision. We didn't appear suddenly. We evolved gradually from earlier hominid species over millions of years. There's no point in our genetic history where something external clearly intervened. No signs of artificial genetic manipulation. Just the slow, messy process of natural evolution. And archaeologically, the development of Sumerian civilization, while impressive, isn't actually mysterious in the way Sitchin suggested. There are predecessor cultures. There's evidence of gradual development. The Ubaid period preceded the Sumerians and showed many of the same characteristics in more primitive form. The Sumerians didn't appear from nowhere. They built on foundations laid by earlier peoples. So the mainstream academic position is clear. Sitchin's theory, while creative and entertaining, isn't supported by the evidence. The translations are faulty. The astronomical claims don't hold up. The genetic and archaeological evidence points elsewhere. Case closed then. Ancient astronauts debunked. The Anunnaki return to the realm of mythology where they belong. Well, not quite. Because here's the thing. Even if Sitchin got the details wrong, even if his translations were faulty and his theory unsupported, he was responding to something real. A genuine puzzle in the historical record. The question of how and why Sumerian civilization developed so quickly and so sophisticatedly remains valid, even if Sitchin's answer wasn't correct. Mainstream archaeology has answers, of course. They point to gradual development, cultural exchange, the benefits of agriculture and urbanization, human ingenuity and adaptability. These are good answers. They're supported by evidence. They don't require invoking anything supernatural or extraterrestrial, but they also require us to accept that humans figured all this out ourselves. That our ancestors, without writing or formal education or accumulated scientific knowledge, developed mathematics sophisticated enough to track celestial movements, built irrigation systems that required advanced understanding of hydraulics, created writing systems from scratch, established legal codes that balanced individual rights with social order. Not impossible. Humans are clever. Given time and motivation, we can figure out remarkably complex things. But the speed of it still raises eyebrows. The level of sophistication still prompts questions. And the Sumerians' own insistence that they were taught, that's hard to completely dismiss, even if we reject Sitchin's explanation for who did the teaching. There's a middle ground that often gets lost in the debate between true believers and hard skeptics. It's possible to acknowledge that Sitchin's specific theory is flawed, while still recognizing that the questions he raised are legitimate. It's possible to reject ancient astronauts, while still finding the Sumerian narrative fascinating and not entirely explained. Some researchers have suggested modified versions of the ancient astronaut theory. Maybe the visitors weren't from another planet but from an earlier, now lost human civilization. Maybe there were survivors of some cataclysm. The flood that appears in so many traditions. who preserved advanced knowledge and shared it with more primitive peoples as they rebuilt. Others point out that from the heavens doesn't necessarily mean from space. Maybe the Anunnaki were from a mountainous region, and heaven simply meant the high places. Maybe they were a more advanced culture from elsewhere in the ancient world who arrived in Mesopotamia and through their superior knowledge seemed godlike to the locals. These theories avoid the astronomical and genetic problems of Sitchin's version while still allowing for the possibility that the Sumerian texts preserve some memory of real contact with more advanced peoples. Or maybe, and this is worth considering, maybe the Sumerians weren't lying and weren't mistaken, but also weren't talking about physical beings at all. Maybe when they said they were taught by the Anunnaki, they were describing something more subtle: inspiration, insight. The mysterious way that knowledge sometimes seems to arrive in human consciousness, as if from an external source. Think about your own experiences with creativity and problem solving. Sometimes you struggle with something, working at it consciously, logically, making little progress. Then you step away, let your mind wander, maybe sleep on it. And suddenly the answer is there, fully formed, as if it arrived from somewhere outside yourself. Artists and inventors often describe their best work this way. It didn't feel like they created it so much as discovered it or received it. The muse, we call it, poetically. Divine inspiration, being in the zone. Different phrases for the same experience of knowledge or creativity flowing from somewhere beyond the conscious ego. What if the Sumerians experienced collective versions of this? What if their rapid cultural development felt to them like being taught because the knowledge seemed to arrive too quickly, too completely, to be purely their own invention? They attributed it to the Anunnaki because they needed a framework to understand where these insights came from. In this interpretation, the Anunnaki are real, but not as physical beings. They're real as archetypes, as representations of the human capacity for inspiration and transcendence. They're the personification of that mysterious source from which new knowledge emerges. This view respects the Sumerian testimony. They really did feel guided and taught. While not requiring literal gods or aliens, it acknowledges that something significant happened, something that transformed human culture, while locating that something within the human psyche rather than in the external physical world. It's a more subtle interpretation than either ancient astronauts are real or it's all just mythology. But subtlety might be what this mystery requires. The truth is, we're still arguing about this 4,000 years later because none of the explanations fully satisfy. The pure skeptical view. It was all just mythology. The Sumerians made it up. Doesn't quite account for the consistency and detail of the texts, or for why they would attribute their achievements to others if they did it themselves. But the literal view. The Anunnaki were physical beings, either extraterrestrial or from some lost advanced civilization. Requires accepting claims that aren't supported by physical evidence and that create more questions than they answer. And the psychological view. It was all internal, projections and archetypes and metaphors. Seems almost too neat, too modern in its assumptions about how ancient peoples thought. Maybe the answer is that all these interpretations capture part of the truth. Maybe the Sumerian experience of the Anunnaki was complex, multi-layered, not reducible to a simple explanation. Maybe they were describing something real that doesn't fit neatly into our categories of myth versus history, internal versus external, metaphorical versus literal. What's clear is that the question matters to people. Sitchin's books have sold millions of copies. Ancient Aliens, the television series, has run for years and sparked countless discussions. People are drawn to this mystery, want to understand it, need to understand it. Why? What's at stake in how we answer the question of the Anunnaki? Perhaps it's about human potential and human identity. If we figured out civilization ourselves, that's empowering. It means we're capable of great things through our own intelligence and effort. We don't need outside help. We're not dependent on others for our achievements. But if we were helped, if we were taught, that's also meaningful. It means we're connected to something larger. We're not isolated on our little planet, struggling alone. The universe is populated with intelligence, and we're part of that larger community, even if we've lost touch with it for now. Both possibilities are, in their own way, profound and hopeful. Or maybe what matters isn't the answer, but the asking. Maybe the real value of the Anunnaki mystery is that it keeps us questioning, wondering, looking at the past with fresh eyes, instead of assuming we already understand everything. Science progresses by questioning received wisdom. New discoveries often come from being willing to consider that we might have gotten something wrong, that there might be more to the story than we thought. The danger of Sitchin-style theories is that they can lead people away from careful, evidence-based thinking. When you decide that mainstream scholars are all wrong and that you've discovered hidden truths they've missed, you're on a path that can lead to believing all sorts of unsupported things. Conspiracy theories. Pseudoscience. A rejection of expertise in favor of appealing stories. But the danger of pure skepticism is different. It's the danger of closing off inquiry too soon. Of being so certain that you know how things must have been that you stop looking at evidence that might suggest otherwise. Of protecting established theories rather than testing them. The ideal is somewhere in the middle. Open-minded skepticism. Willing to consider new ideas but requiring good evidence before accepting them. Respecting expertise while recognizing that experts can be wrong. Taking ancient texts seriously without necessarily taking them literally. And that's hard. It's much easier to pick a side and stay there. To decide either that ancient astronauts explain everything or that anyone who questions mainstream archaeology is a crackpot. Nuance is difficult. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. But that's where wisdom lives. In the uncomfortable space, where we admit we don't have all the answers, where we hold multiple possibilities in mind at once, where we let questions remain open. The Sumerians wrote down their stories about the Anunnaki. They believed these stories mattered. They preserved them carefully, copied them generation after generation, taught them to their children. The stories survived the fall of Sumerian civilization, were adopted by the Babylonians, influenced cultures across the ancient world, and eventually, through thousands of years of transmission and translation, reached us. That's remarkable by itself. These ideas have survived 5,000 years. They've outlasted empires, outlasted religions, outlasted languages. They've been written on clay, carved in stone, printed on paper, displayed on screens. They've crossed continents and oceans. They've been interpreted and reinterpreted by countless cultures, each finding their own meaning in the ancient words. And they still fascinate us. Still make us wonder. Still seem to touch something deep in the human psyche. Maybe that's what the Anunnaki really are. Not aliens, not gods, not metaphors, but something else entirely. Something that exists in the space between cultures, between generations, between the ancient past and the uncertain future. An enduring question about who we are and where we came from. A mirror in which each age sees its own hopes and fears reflected. The Sumerians looked at the Anunnaki and saw their creators, their teachers, the source of their civilization. Sitchin looked at the same texts and saw ancient astronauts, evidence that we're not alone in the cosmos. Modern scholars look and see mythology, the human tendency to tell stories about ourselves through divine characters. Maybe they're all right. Maybe they're all wrong. Maybe the truth is something none of them captured, something we still don't have the concepts or language to fully express. The night deepens. The stars continue their ancient dance across the sky. And somewhere beneath the Iraqi sand, clay tablets wait to be discovered, their wedge-shaped marks still sharp after millennia, ready to tell their stories to whoever has the patience to listen and the wisdom to wonder. The Anunnaki mystery isn't solved. Perhaps it can't be solved, not completely, but in wrestling with it, in considering the possibilities, in holding our certainties lightly and our questions carefully, we participate in something larger than ourselves. We join a conversation that spans millennia, that connects us to the earliest humans who looked up at the stars and asked the eternal question, are we alone? Where did we come from? What does it all mean? The Sumerians had their answer. Sitchin had his. Mainstream scholars have theirs. And you. You get to decide what you believe. Not based on which authority figure sounds most convincing, but based on your own careful consideration of the evidence, your own willingness to sit with uncertainty, your own sense of what rings true. That's the real gift the Anunnaki give us. Not answers, but better questions. Not certainty, but the courage to keep wondering. And in a world that often demands we pick sides and defend positions and never admit doubt. That might be the most valuable gift of all. Chapter 5. The Anunnaki's Legacy in Modern Culture. 5,000 years is a long time. Civilizations rise and fall. Languages are born, flourish, and die. Cities turn to dust. Rivers change their courses. Entire landscapes transform beyond recognition. But some things persist. Some stories refuse to die. They adapt, evolve, get retold in new contexts with new details, but their essential core remains recognizable across the millennia. The Anunnaki are one of those stories. Their influence didn't end when Sumerian civilization fell. It spread, transformed, and echoes through culture after culture, right down to our present day. Let's trace those echoes. Let's see where the ancient Mesopotamian gods left their fingerprints on the stories we still tell ourselves. Start with the most obvious connection: the Bible. The Hebrew Scriptures, the foundation of Judaism and Christianity, emerged from a world deeply influenced by Mesopotamian culture. The ancient Israelites lived among and sometimes were conquered by the descendants of the Sumerians. They would have known these stories. And if you read the Bible with Sumerian mythology in mind, certain passages suddenly resonate differently. Genesis, chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. It's a strange little passage that many readers skip past without much thought. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown, the sons of God. The Nephilim, heroes of old. Sound familiar? This passage has puzzled biblical scholars for millennia. Who were these sons of God who intermarried with humans? What were the Nephilim? The text treats them as if they're well known, as if the original audience would immediately understand the reference. But for modern readers, it's cryptic. Unless you know about the Anunnaki, then suddenly it makes sense. The sons of God. Divine beings who came to earth. The Nephilim. Offspring of divine and human unions. Heroes of old. The semi-divine kings and warriors of ancient legend. It's the same story, translated into Hebrew monotheism, but the bones of the older Mesopotamian narrative are clearly visible. The word Nephilim itself is interesting. It comes from a Hebrew root meaning to fall, the fallen ones, those who fell from heaven to earth, those who from heaven to earth came. The parallel with the Anunnaki is almost exact. Christian tradition later interpreted these sons of God as fallen angels, demons who rebelled against God and corrupted humanity. The Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish text that didn't make it into the canonical Bible, expands on this story. It names the fallen angels, describes what they taught humanity. Metallurgy, cosmetics, weapons making, astronomy, magic, knowledge that humans weren't supposed to have, given by divine beings who violated the natural order. It's a darker version of the Anunnaki story. Instead of benevolent teachers, we have rebellious angels sharing forbidden knowledge. But the basic structure is identical. Divine beings come to Earth, interact with humans, share advanced knowledge, produce offspring that are partially divine, and ultimately create a situation that requires divine intervention to correct. The Great Flood follows immediately after this passage in Genesis. God sees that human wickedness has increased, perhaps as a result of this mixing of divine and human, and decides to wipe out humanity and start over. Just like Enlil in the Sumerian version, only Noah, like Ziusudra before him, is warned and survives. The similarities aren't coincidental. Most scholars agree that the biblical flood narrative was influenced by, or perhaps directly derived from, the much older Mesopotamian flood stories. The details are too similar. A righteous man warned by a deity, a boat built to specific dimensions, animals saved in pairs, a bird sent out to check for dry land, the boat landing on a mountain, sacrifices offered afterward, the deity smelling the pleasing aroma and deciding not to destroy humanity again. The Bible preserves the story, but adapts it to monotheism. Instead of a council of gods debating humanity's fate, there's one god making the decision. Instead of Enki secretly warning Zeusudra, God openly instructs Noah. But the underlying narrative, a divine decision to destroy humanity by flood, one family saved through divine warning, the preservation of animal life, the new beginning after the waters recede. It's all there in the Sumerian original, written down 1,000 years before Genesis. This doesn't mean the Bible is just copying earlier stories. Cultural transmission is more complex than that. Stories get adapted, reinterpreted, given new meanings in new contexts. But it does mean that the Anunnaki narrative, in various forms, became part of the foundational stories of Western civilization. Billions of people today know the story of Noah's flood without realizing they're hearing a version of a tale first told in ancient Sumeria about the Anunnaki and their complex relationship with humanity. The influence spreads further. Greek mythology, which shaped so much of Western thought, has striking parallels to the Anunnaki stories. The Greek gods lived on Mount Olympus, a high place, just as the Anunnaki were associated with heaven and their temples were built as artificial mountains. The Greek gods were immortal but not omnipotent. They had personalities, conflicts, love affairs, feuds. They involved themselves in human affairs, sometimes helping, sometimes harming. They produced offspring with humans. The heroes like Hercules and Perseus, semi-divine beings with extraordinary abilities. Zeus, the king of the gods, parallels Anu. Poseidon, god of waters, echoes Enki. The Titans, the older generation of gods who ruled before the Olympians, might represent a distant memory of the Anunnaki themselves, displaced in Greek tradition as the Olympians displaced the Titans. Did the Greeks directly borrow from Mesopotamian mythology? Probably not in any simple way. But cultural exchange happened. Trade routes connected the ancient world. Stories traveled with merchants. When Alexander the Great conquered Mesopotamia in the 4th century BCE, Greek culture collided directly with the descendants of Sumerian civilization. Ideas flowed both directions. And the underlying themes? Gods who are powerful but not perfect, who interact with humans, who produce semi-divine offspring, who taught humanity the arts of civilization. These appear across so many cultures that they seem almost universal. Maybe that's because they all borrowed from a common source. Or maybe these are archetypal patterns that emerge naturally in how humans think about the divine. Carl Jung would have said the latter. Jung believed in a collective unconscious, a shared psychological substrate that all humans inherit. Certain images, patterns, and narratives recur across cultures, not because of borrowing, but because they're hardwired into how human minds work. The wise old man, the great mother, the trickster, the hero's journey, and perhaps the teachers from above who give humanity knowledge. In this view, the Anunnaki aren't historical beings but psychological realities. They represent something real in human experience, but that reality is internal rather than external. They're how we personify the experience of receiving knowledge, of making cultural leaps, of feeling connected to something greater than ourselves. Whether you find that explanation satisfying probably depends on your worldview, but it does account for why similar stories appear in cultures that had no contact with Mesopotamia. Native American traditions speak of sky beings who taught humans. Pacific Islander cultures have stories of gods arriving from beyond the horizon. African folklore includes tales of civilizing heroes with supernatural origins. Hindu mythology describes the Devas and Asuras, divine beings who interact with humans, produce offspring with them, and influence human development. Are all these stories echoes of the Anunnaki? Or are they independent developments of similar ideas? Or are they all pointing towards something real that different cultures experienced and described in their own terms? The question becomes even more interesting when you look at what these beings supposedly taught. Across cultures, the list is remarkably consistent. Agriculture, metalworking, writing, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law. The fundamental technologies and knowledge systems that enable civilization. It's as if humanity everywhere preserved a memory that these crucial innovations came from outside, that they were gifts rather than discoveries. And perhaps they were. in a sense. Not gifts from alien beings or gods, but gifts from the rare geniuses who figured these things out. The first farmer who domesticated wheat, the first smith who learned to work bronze, the first scribe who turned speech into symbols. These innovations probably did seem divine to those who witnessed them. Imagine being a hunter-gatherer and seeing someone plant seeds that grow into food. It would look like magic. Imagine seeing someone heat rocks and pour out liquid metal that hardens into tools. You might well think they had knowledge from the gods. Over time, the individual innovators would be forgotten, but the sense that civilization came as a gift would remain. Personified as gods, as teachers from the sky, as the Anunnaki. Or maybe not. Maybe there's still something more to the story. Because here's what's interesting. The memory is so persistent, so universal, so specific in its details. Gods from the sky. Knowledge given as a gift. A time before when humans lived primitively, and a time after when we had civilization. If it were just psychological projection or vague cultural memory, you'd expect more variation. But the core narrative is remarkably stable across cultures that had no contact with each other for thousands of years. Which brings us to modern times. To our own culture's fascination with the Anunnaki and what it might tell us about ourselves. Turn on the television and you'll find Ancient Aliens, a series that has run for multiple seasons, exploring the possibility that extraterrestrial beings visited Earth in the distant past and influenced human development. The Anunnaki feature prominently. Each episode examines ancient structures, texts, or artifacts through the lens of ancient astronaut theory. Is it good science? Not really. The show presents speculation as fact, cherry-picks evidence, and often ignores more mundane explanations in favor of sensational ones. Serious scholars generally dismiss it. But is it tapping into something real in terms of human curiosity and need? Absolutely. Millions of people watch. They find the ideas compelling. They want to believe that there's more to human history than the conventional narrative. They want mystery, wonder, connection to the cosmos. Why? Perhaps because modern life, for all its technological marvels, can feel small. We know the Earth is a tiny planet circling an average star in an ordinary galaxy among billions of galaxies. We know we're the product of blind evolutionary forces operating over billions of years. We know the universe is vast, old, and ultimately indifferent to our existence. That knowledge can be liberating. It can also be lonely. The idea that we were visited, taught, that we matter to someone or something out there in the cosmic vastness. It's comforting. It makes us special again. It gives our existence meaning and purpose beyond mere biological accident. The Anunnaki, in modern popular culture, serve that function. They're a link to something greater. Evidence that we're not alone. Proof that the universe contains intelligence and purpose, and that we're part of that larger story. Video games feature the Anunnaki. Science fiction novels build plots around them. Comic books incorporate them into superhero mythologies. They've become part of our modern mythological landscape, alongside vampires, zombies, and superheroes. And like all good myths, they're flexible. They can be heroes or villains, benevolent teachers or manipulative overlords, saviors who gifted us civilization or slavers who created us as workers. Different stories emphasize different aspects, but the core concept remains: powerful beings from elsewhere who shaped humanity's development in the distant past. There's something appealing about that ambiguity. The Anunnaki aren't simply good or evil. They're complex, with their own agendas, their own conflicts. They're more interesting than the purely benevolent space brothers of early UFO mythology or the purely malevolent aliens of invasion stories. They're like the Sumerian gods. Powerful, sophisticated, operating by their own logic, not easily categorized. Modern retellings often emphasize the genetic engineering aspect. We were created, designed, our DNA modified by beings with advanced biotechnology. This resonates in an age when we ourselves are learning to edit genes, to modify organisms at the molecular level. We're becoming the creators, the genetic engineers. And perhaps, in doing so, we're following in the footsteps of the Anunnaki, becoming like our makers. That's a powerful narrative. It raises profound questions about the ethics of creation, the responsibilities of creators toward their creations, the nature of consciousness and personhood. If we were designed rather than naturally evolved, what does that mean for our identity, for our purpose, for our future? These are the questions science fiction explores. They're also the questions ancient peoples explored through their myths. Same fundamental concerns, different vocabulary. The Sumerians asked these questions through stories about the Anunnaki. We ask them through stories about genetic engineering and artificial intelligence. The medium changes, but the inquiry persists. And maybe that's the real legacy of the Anunnaki. Not whatever historical reality might or might not underlie the myths, but the questions those myths enable us to ask. Questions about creation and purpose, about power and responsibility, about the relationship between creators and the created, about knowledge and its costs, about what it means to be human. The Sumerians wrestled with these questions 5,000 years ago. We're still wrestling with them today. And in both cases, we tell stories to help us think through the answers. Their stories featured the Anunnaki. Our stories feature, well, sometimes they still feature the Anunnaki. Other times they feature AI, aliens, genetic engineers, gods, or other powerful beings who might have shaped or might shape humanity's destiny. The names change, the technologies update, but the fundamental story remains remarkably constant. There's something about the narrative of powerful beings influencing human development that speaks to us across the ages. Perhaps because it's true. In some sense, we're still figuring out how to articulate. Not true in the literal way that Sitchin believed. Probably not true in the way the Sumerians believed. But true in capturing something essential about the human experience. True in the way that myths are true. Pointing toward realities that factual language can't quite capture. We are shaped by forces larger than ourselves. That much is undeniable. Whether you call those forces the Anunnaki, God, evolution, culture, history, or something else entirely, we're products of inheritances we didn't choose. We carry within us the accumulated wisdom and folly of countless generations. We're taught by the past, even when we're not aware of it. In that sense, we're all children of the Anunnaki. Not literally, but mythologically. We're all recipients of gifts we didn't earn. Language, culture, knowledge, technology. We all stand on foundations laid by others. We're all connected to a story larger than our individual lives. And when we look up at the stars, as humans have done since the beginning, we're not just seeing distant suns. We're seeing possibility, mystery, the same wonder that made the Sumerians imagine gods dwelling there, watching over us, teaching us, connecting us to the cosmos. Maybe they were right. Maybe not in the details, but in the essential insight. We are connected to something larger. The universe is our context, our origin, our home. And somewhere in that vast darkness, perhaps we're not alone. Perhaps we never were. Perhaps there are others out there, asking the same questions, telling their own versions of the Anunnaki story, wondering if they too were visited, taught, shaped by beings from elsewhere. Or perhaps we are alone, and the Anunnaki are purely our creation, our way of understanding ourselves and our place in the cosmos. That would be okay too. It would mean that everything we've achieved, we achieved ourselves. That the teachers from the sky were really just the brightest among us, elevated to divine status. That humanity, for all our flaws, managed to create civilization through our own cleverness and determination. Either way, the story enriches us. It gives us a way to think about big questions. It connects us to our ancestors. It opens our minds to possibilities beyond the mundane. And on a quiet night, when you look up at the stars and feel that sense of wonder, that intuition that there's more to reality than meets the eye, well, maybe in that moment, you're touching something the Sumerians knew. Something that transcends the question of whether the Anunnaki were literally real. Something that makes the story true in a deeper sense. The gift of wonder. The gift of questions. The gift of stories that make us think. That's what the Anunnaki give us. Whether they were gods, aliens, metaphors, or memories of something we've forgotten. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the mystery is more valuable than any answer could be. Chapter 6. Meaning and Reflection. There's a question that every child asks. usually around the age of 4 or 5, that philosophers have been trying to answer for millennia. It's simple, direct, and somehow impossible to fully answer. Where did I come from? Parents usually respond with age-appropriate explanations, but the question runs deeper than biology. It's not just about reproduction. It's about origin, purpose, meaning. Where did I come from? Why am I here? What's my story? Adults ask the same question, just scaled up. Where did humanity come from? Why are we here? What's our story? Every culture in human history has had to answer these questions, and every culture has created stories, myths, legends, sacred texts, to provide those answers. Because humans need origin stories, we need to know where we came from to understand who we are and where we might be going. The Sumerians had their answer. The Anunnaki created us, taught us, gave us civilization. We exist because they needed workers, but also perhaps because Enki saw potential in us, because we were worth saving from the flood, because we could learn and create and build. Our purpose was service, but also growth, development, the exploration of our own capabilities. It's a remarkably sophisticated origin story. Not a god, spoke and we appeared, but powerful beings engaged in a complex process that resulted in our creation. It allows for agency, both the Anunnaki's and eventually our own. It acknowledges that creation has purposes, some noble and some utilitarian. It doesn't pretend that existence is simple or that our origins are purely about love and blessing. The Judeo-Christian tradition modified this story. God created humans in his image, gave us dominion over the earth, placed us in a garden. But we disobeyed, sought knowledge we weren't supposed to have, and were cast out into the world where we must work by the sweat of our brow. It's a story about innocence lost, about the price of knowledge, about separation from our Creator. Both stories, the Sumerian and the biblical, wrestle with similar themes. Knowledge comes with a cost. Creation implies purpose. We're separate from, but connected to, higher powers. We must work, struggle, strive. Yet we're also capable of great things. Modern scientific understanding offers a different origin story. We're the products of billions of years of evolution, descended from single-celled organisms through an unbroken chain of reproduction and genetic variation. We exist because we survived, because our ancestors were slightly better adapted than the competition, because random mutations occasionally produced advantageous traits. There's no purpose in the cosmic sense. We're here because chemistry and physics happened to produce self-replicating molecules that gradually became more complex. It's a story many people find unsatisfying, not because it's untrue. The evidence for evolution is overwhelming, but because it feels meaningless. We're accidents, cosmic flukes. The universe doesn't care about us. There's no grand plan, no purpose, no meaning beyond what we create for ourselves. Yet even this story has a kind of grandeur. We're made of stardust. Literally, the atoms in our bodies were forged in the hearts of dying stars billions of years ago. Where the universe become conscious of itself, matter organized in such a way that it can contemplate its own existence. We're evolution's way of looking back at its own history. That's profound in its own way. But here's what's interesting. Most people don't actually choose between these stories. They hold multiple narratives simultaneously, finding truth in each. You can accept evolutionary biology while still feeling that life has purpose and meaning. You can reject literal interpretation of ancient myths while still finding wisdom in those stories. You can be moved by the Anunnaki narrative without believing they were literally real. Because origin stories aren't just about facts, they're about meaning, identity, how we understand ourselves and our place in existence. And meaning operates on a different level than fact. The Anunnaki story, whether literally true or not, captures something real about the human experience. We do feel shaped by forces beyond ourselves. We do receive knowledge and culture from previous generations. We are, in a sense, created beings, not by gods or aliens, but by the accumulated choices and wisdom of our ancestors. We inherit language we didn't invent. We use technologies we didn't develop. We think thoughts made possible by conceptual frameworks built over millennia. In that sense, the Anunnaki are real, not as physical beings, but as a representation of everything that came before us, everything that made us possible, everything we've received rather than created. They're the past. The teachers, the givers of gifts we can never repay because the givers are long dead. And like the Anunnaki in the Sumerian stories, these inherited gifts are complex. Some are beneficial, some are burdensome. We inherit wisdom and we inherit trauma. We receive knowledge and we receive prejudices. The past shapes us in ways both liberating and constraining. How we relate to this inheritance matters. The Sumerian approach was gratitude, build temples, make offerings, honor the gods who gave us civilization, maintain the relationship through ritual and remembrance. Modern culture is more ambivalent. We're often trying to escape the past, to throw off inherited constraints, to create ourselves anew. We question authority, reject tradition, insist on figuring things out for ourselves. There's value in that. Traditions can become oppressive. Inherited wisdom isn't always wise. Each generation needs to examine what it receives and decide what to keep and what to discard. But there's also danger in completely severing connection with the past, in forgetting that we stand on shoulders of giants, in assuming we can start from scratch, as if all the hard-won knowledge of previous generations is disposable. The Anunnaki story suggests a middle path. Yes, we were created and taught by others. We didn't figure everything out ourselves. We owe debts to the past. But also, we're not slaves. We have agency. We can learn, grow, even surpass our teachers. The relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity in Sumerian myths is complex, sometimes harmonious, and sometimes conflictual. That seems right. That seems true to human experience across time. There's another dimension to origin stories that we haven't fully explored. They don't just tell us where we came from. They tell us what we are. They define human nature. If the Anunnaki created us to be workers, servants, then hard work is built into our nature. We're meant to labor, to build, to create. That's not a burden imposed from outside. It's what we are. And there's dignity in that, even if it also means we must struggle. If we're made in God's image, then we have divine potential. We're capable of creativity, love, moral choice. But we're also fallen, flawed, prone to error. We need redemption, guidance, grace. If we're products of evolution, then we're survival machines, shaped by millions of years of competition. We're tribal, hierarchical, aggressive, but also cooperative, empathetic, creative. We're animals, but animals with unique cognitive abilities that allow us to transcend our programming to some degree. Each story highlights different aspects of human nature. Each suggests different possibilities and limitations. And maybe the fullest understanding comes from holding all these perspectives simultaneously, seeing how they complement and contradict each other, using the tensions between them to develop a richer understanding of what humans are. The Sumerians saw humans as created beings, with divine heritage, but mortal limitations. We could learn godly skills. Writing, mathematics, astronomy. But we would always be subordinate to the Anunnaki. Our lifespans were limited. Our power was constrained. Yet within those limitations, we could achieve great things. We could build cities, create art, develop culture, pass knowledge to future generations. There's a wisdom in that view. It's humble. We're not gods. We're not self-created. We have limits. But it's also empowering. Within our sphere, we can create, grow, develop. We're not nothing. We're not meaningless. We're junior partners in the cosmic project, valuable even if not ultimate. Modern culture oscillates between two extremes. Sometimes we're grandiose. Humans are the pinnacle of creation. We can solve any problem. We'll eventually conquer nature and even death itself through technology. Other times, we're nihilistic. Humans are a cancer on the planet. We're destroying everything. We're meaningless specks in an uncaring universe. The Sumerian view is neither. We're significant, but not supreme. We're capable, but not omnipotent. We matter, but so do others. It's a balanced perspective that might serve us better than our current extremes. Let's think about power and responsibility. This is central to the Anunnaki narrative and deeply relevant to modern life. The Anunnaki had power, immense power. They could create life, destroy cities, control the forces of nature, and with that power came choices. How to use it, for what purposes, with what regard for those affected by their decisions. The stories show the Anunnaki wrestling with these questions. Enlil decides to destroy humanity because we're too noisy, too troublesome. It's an abuse of power, a disproportionate response. But Enki argues for mercy, finds ways to preserve life, exercises his power more wisely. The contrast between them is instructive. Today, humans have power our ancestors couldn't have imagined. We can split atoms, edit genes, alter the climate, create artificial intelligence, communicate instantly across the globe. We're becoming, in some ways, like the Anunnaki of the ancient stories. We have godlike powers. Do we have godlike wisdom? That's less clear. The Sumerian stories suggest that having power doesn't automatically mean having wisdom. The Anunnaki, for all their capabilities, made mistakes. They fought among themselves. They sometimes acted rashly. They had to learn, to debate, to reconsider their choices. If powerful gods needed to exercise restraint and wisdom, how much more do we? We're wielding technologies we barely understand, with global consequences we can't fully predict. The ethics of genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, climate intervention, nuclear weapons, these are questions the Anunnaki would recognize. How do you use great power responsibly? How do you balance different goods? How do you account for unintended consequences? The Sumerian approach was to build in checks and balances. Multiple gods with different domains and perspectives. Councils where decisions were debated. Rituals and laws that constrained even divine action. Not perfect, but better than unconstrained power in the hands of any single entity. We might learn from that. Our technologies need governance, ethical frameworks, democratic oversight. Power needs to be distributed, debated, checked. The person or group with the capability to do something shouldn't automatically have the authority to do it. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. The Anunnaki stories are ultimately about relationships, between powerful and less powerful, between creators and created, between those who know and those who learn, between different factions with different agendas, between the individual and the collective. These are human relationships, writ large. Every parent is, to their child, like the Anunnaki. Powerful, knowing, shaping. Every teacher, every mentor, every leader operates in this space. We're constantly navigating the dynamics of power, knowledge, responsibility, care, and we're also on the other side of those relationships. We're all children, students, followers, creatures shaped by others. We've all received more than we created. We all stand on foundations laid by others. We all owe debts we can never fully repay. How do we live well in that complexity? The Sumerian answer was through gratitude, through ritual, through maintaining relationships with the sources of our gifts. Honor your gods. Remember your teachers. Maintain the temples. Pass on what you've received. Modern individualism resists this. We want to be self-made, beholden to no one. But that's an illusion. We're all products of countless gifts, seen and unseen. Language, culture, knowledge, the very neurons in our brains shaped by our experiences. All given, all inherited. Maybe the Anunnaki story, stripped of its supernatural elements, is simply telling us to remember this, to live with gratitude, to honor what came before, to use our gifts responsibly because we hold them in trust for future generations, to be good ancestors to those who will come after us, as we hope our ancestors tried to be for us. There's something deeply peaceful about that perspective. It relieves us of the burden of being entirely self-created. It connects us to something larger than ourselves. It gives our actions meaning beyond our individual lives. What we build, what we learn, what we pass on, it matters. It becomes part of the inheritance for those who follow. We become, in a sense, the Anunnaki for future generations. The teachers, the givers of gifts, the ones who shape the world they inherit, for better or worse. That's a sobering responsibility. But it's also a profound honor. The Sumerians understood this. Their civilization lasted over 1,000 years because each generation saw itself as maintaining something precious, something worth preserving and passing on. The temples, the texts, the knowledge, the culture, these were gifts to be stewarded, not just consumed. When Sumerian civilization finally fell, conquered by others, the gifts didn't die. They were adopted, adapted, carried forward. The Babylonians built on Sumerian foundations. The Greeks learned from Babylon. The Romans learned from the Greeks. The medieval Islamic scholars preserved and expanded that knowledge. The European Renaissance rediscovered it. And we, today, are still using Sumerian mathematics, still reading Sumerian stories, still wrestling with questions the Sumerians asked. The Anunnaki, real or not, gave gifts that lasted 5,000 years and counting. That's immortality of a sort, not the personal immortality that Gilgamesh sought and failed to find, but the immortality of culture, of ideas, of contributions that outlive the individual. Maybe that's the answer to the question of meaning. We exist to receive, to grow, to create, and to pass on. We're links in a chain that extends from the distant past into the unknown future. Our individual links might be small, might seem insignificant, but the chain itself is magnificent, and every link matters. The Anunnaki gave humanity civilization, or so the story says. Whether they were gods, aliens, or simply the personification of our ancestors' accumulated wisdom, the gift was real, and it carries a responsibility to use it well, to add to it if we can, to pass it on intact, or better yet, enriched. 5,000 years from now, what will people say we gave them? What gifts will we be remembered for? Or will they say we squandered our inheritance, that we received much and passed on little, that we were poor ancestors? These are the questions that matter, the questions that give life purpose beyond personal pleasure or success, the questions that connect us to something eternal. And maybe that's why the Anunnaki story persists, because it asks these questions in a way that captures imagination and stirs something deep in the human soul. It reminds us that we're part of something larger, something that extends far beyond our brief individual lives. On a practical level, probably very little changes whether the Anunnaki were real or not. The sun will still rise tomorrow. You'll still face the same daily challenges. The mechanics of life continue regardless. But on a deeper level, it matters what stories we tell ourselves. It matters what we believe about where we came from and why we're here. Because those beliefs shape how we live, what we value, what we strive for. If we're accidents in an uncaring universe, why not pursue only personal pleasure? If we're servants created by selfish gods, why not resent our existence? If we're fallen creatures in need of redemption, why not despair at our flaws? But if we're participants in a grand story, recipients of precious gifts, links in a chain connecting past and future, beings with both limitations and potential, shaped by others but capable of shaping in turn, then life has richness, purpose, meaning. Then our choices matter. Then we have roles to play that transcend our individual existence. The Anunnaki story, at its best, tells us this. You are created, but not determined. You are taught, but can learn. You are limited, but capable. You are part of something larger. Your life has context, meaning, purpose. And perhaps that's true, whether the Anunnaki themselves were true or not. Chapter 7. Return to the desert. The desert is timeless in a way that cities can never be. Cities change, evolve, buildings rise and crumble. Streets get renamed. Populations shift. What was once the center becomes the periphery. What was new becomes old, becomes forgotten. But the desert simply is. The sand shifts with the wind. Yes, dunes rise and fall. But the essential character of the place remains constant. Hot days, cold nights, silence, emptiness. The kind of space where thoughts can expand without hitting walls. We began this journey in the Iraqi desert, standing where Uruk once stood, imagining the great ziggurat rising toward the heavens. Now, as our story draws to a close, Let's return there. Back to the sand, the silence, the stars appearing as darkness falls. What do we know after all this exploration? What can we say with certainty about the Anunnaki? We know the Sumerians believed in them. That's not speculation. That's historical fact, written in thousands of clay tablets, built into the architecture of their cities, woven into the fabric of their civilization. The Anunnaki were real to the Sumerians, as real as anything could be. More real, perhaps, than many things we consider factual today. We know the stories were detailed and consistent across centuries. This wasn't vague folklore. It was precise mythology, if that's not a contradiction in terms. Names, relationships, domains, stories, attributes, all carefully recorded and transmitted. The Sumerians took this seriously. They devoted enormous resources to it. They shaped their entire society around it. We know these stories influenced later cultures profoundly. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hebrews, the Greeks. They all encountered Mesopotamian mythology and were changed by it. Elements of the Anunnaki narrative appear throughout ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean cultures. The fingerprints are undeniable. We know Sumerian civilization achieved remarkable things. Mathematics, writing, law, astronomy, agriculture, urban planning, literature. They were pioneers in all of it. Whether the Anunnaki had anything to do with that achievement or not, the achievement itself is real and astonishing. And we know the questions the Sumerians asked are still our questions. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Are we alone? How should we live? What matters? These aren't ancient questions that modern people have outgrown. They're eternal questions that each generation must answer for itself. But what don't we know? What remains mystery rather than knowledge? We don't know if the Anunnaki existed as physical beings. We have no bodies, no artifacts that are unambiguously theirs, no physical evidence that would satisfy a skeptical investigator. We have stories, beliefs, second-hand accounts. That's not nothing, but it's not proof. We don't know how the Sumerians acquired their knowledge so quickly. The explanations range from they figured it out themselves through brilliance and hard work, to they were taught by advanced beings, to they inherited it from earlier cultures we haven't discovered yet. All are possible. None are proven. We don't know what the Sumerian texts really mean in many cases. Translation is difficult, interpretation is subjective, and we're separated by 5,000 years of cultural change. We do our best, but certainty eludes us. We don't know what experiences, if any, underlie the myths. Were they purely imaginative? Were they based on real events, however distorted by time and retelling? Were they metaphorical expressions of psychological or spiritual truths? We can theorize, but we can't know. And perhaps most importantly, we don't know what it all means for us today. Even if we could definitively answer every factual question about the Anunnaki, we'd still face the deeper question, so what? What difference does it make to how we live? That's not a dismissive question. It's the most important question. Because knowledge that doesn't connect to life, that doesn't help us live better or understand ourselves more deeply, is just trivia. Interesting, perhaps, but ultimately beside the point. So what does the Anunnaki story give us that matters? First, it gives us perspective. We think of ourselves as modern, as having progressed far beyond our primitive ancestors. And in some ways, we have. Our technology is more sophisticated. Our scientific understanding is deeper. Our lifespans are longer. But the Sumerians 5,000 years ago were asking the same fundamental questions we ask. They were grappling with the same basic challenges of existence. They were building civilizations, creating art, falling in love, raising children, contemplating mortality, seeking meaning. They were fully human as we are. The details of daily life were different, but the core experience of being human was the same. That's humbling. It suggests that for all our progress, we haven't actually moved that far. We have better tools, more knowledge, longer lives. But we're still wrestling with the same mysteries. We still don't really know why we're here or what it all means. We still face the void and try to fill it with stories, relationships, achievements, beliefs. The Anunnaki story reminds us that this is the human condition. It's not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be lived. Our ancestors 5,000 years ago didn't have all the answers. Neither do we. Neither will our descendants 5,000 years hence, assuming we survive that long. Second, the story gives us connection. When we read Sumerian texts, when we think about the Anunnaki, we're participating in a conversation that spans millennia. We're connecting with people long dead who nevertheless speak to us across the ages. Their words survived. Their questions survived. Their wonder survived. That's extraordinary when you think about it. The individual Sumerians are gone. Their bodies are dust. Their voices are silent. But their thoughts remain, preserved in clay, transmitted through culture, arriving in our minds 5,000 years later. We're not isolated in time. We're part of a continuum. What we think today is shaped by what they thought then. What future people will think will be shaped by what we think now. We're all connected, all part of the same long human story. The Anunnaki are a thread in that story. Whether they were real or not, they connect us to the past. They give us a way to think about questions that matter. They remind us that humans have always looked up at the stars and wondered. Third, the story gives us permission to wonder. In a culture that often demands certainty, that treats not knowing as weakness, the Anunnaki mystery is refreshingly unresolved. We don't know. We can't know. And that's okay. Science is wonderful, but it can't answer every question. Some questions lie outside its domain. Questions of meaning, purpose, value, beauty. These aren't scientific questions. You can't prove or disprove meaning in a laboratory. The Anunnaki exist in that space between what we can prove and what we can imagine. They invite speculation, contemplation, wonder. They remind us that mystery isn't a problem to be eliminated, but a feature of existence to be embraced. Not all mysteries, of course. We should absolutely try to understand as much as we can through careful observation, rigorous thinking, and honest inquiry. But once we've reached the limits of what evidence can tell us, we shouldn't pretend to certainty we don't have. Better to sit with the mystery, to let it open our minds rather than close them. Fourth, the story gives us metaphors for thinking about power, knowledge, and responsibility. Even if we strip away all supernatural elements, the narrative of powerful beings sharing knowledge with less powerful beings is relevant to modern life. Parents and children, teachers and students, leaders and citizens, technologists and users. Every day, we navigate relationships where power and knowledge are unevenly distributed. How do we use power responsibly? How do we share knowledge without controlling? How do we learn without becoming dependent? How do we receive gifts with gratitude without becoming subordinate? The Sumerian stories explore these dynamics through the relationship between Anunnaki and humans. Sometimes the gods are wise and benevolent. Sometimes they're capricious and harsh. Sometimes they help. Sometimes they hinder. It's complex, messy, realistic. That complexity is valuable. It reminds us that power relationships are rarely simple, that those with power have obligations as well as privileges, that those without power have agency and dignity, that the ideal relationship between teacher and student, or creator and created, involves respect, reciprocity, and eventual autonomy. As humans gain more power over nature, over life itself, over the future, we're essentially becoming the Anunnaki of our own story. We're the ones with the knowledge and capability to shape what comes next. Are we wise enough? Responsible enough? Compassionate enough? The Sumerian stories suggest that even the gods struggled with these questions, which is oddly comforting. It means the difficulty isn't a sign of our inadequacy, but a reflection of the genuine challenges involved in wielding power ethically. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, the story gives us hope. Not naive hope that everything will be fine, but deeper hope that human existence has meaning, that we're part of something larger, that our struggles and achievements matter. Whether the Anunnaki were gods, aliens, or metaphors, the story they inhabit is fundamentally optimistic. Yes, humans were created as servants. Yes, we face limitations. Yes, we sometimes displease our creators. But we also learn, we grow, We surprise even ourselves with what we're capable of. We create beauty. We develop wisdom. We persist despite obstacles. The story of the Anunnaki is ultimately the story of humanity, rising from primitive beginnings to civilization, from ignorance to knowledge, from powerlessness to capability. And while we received help along the way, whether divine, extraterrestrial, or simply from earlier generations of humans, the achievements are ours. We did the learning. We did the building. We developed the skills, created the culture, passed on the knowledge. That's worth celebrating. Whatever else we are, whatever our origins, however we got here, humans have proven capable of remarkable things. We've survived ice ages and plagues and wars and catastrophes. We've built civilizations that lasted thousands of years. We've created art that still moves us across millennia. We've asked questions that still matter. And we're still here. Still asking. Still building. Still hoping. Still wondering. The Sumerians would recognize us, I think. For all the surface differences, our technology, our knowledge, our changed circumstances, we're fundamentally the same creatures they were. We still look up at the stars in wonder. We still tell stories to make sense of existence. We still love, fear, hope, dream. The Anunnaki, whether they watch from the heavens or exist only in stories, would see that continuity. The beings they supposedly created or taught have persisted. We've taken the gifts. Writing, mathematics, law, agriculture, all the tools of civilization, and built upon them. We've become, in some ways, creators ourselves. Night has fully fallen now, in our imagined return to the Iraqi desert. The ruins of Uruk are shadows against shadows. But above, the stars shine with the same light that illuminated them 5,000 years ago. The same stars the Sumerian astronomers tracked so carefully. The same stars they believed were the domain of Anu and the Anunnaki. Are the Anunnaki up there, watching? Did they ever exist at all? Will we ever know for certain? Probably not. Certainly not tonight. And maybe that's fitting. Maybe some mysteries should remain mysterious. Maybe some questions should stay open. What matters isn't whether we have the answer. What matters is that we asked the question, that we took the time to explore, to think, to wonder, that we connected with our ancestors across the millennia, sharing their curiosity, if not their conclusions. The wind picks up, the desert wind that has blown across this landscape since long before humans arrived and will blow long after we're gone. It carries sand, reshaping dunes, gradually burying and revealing the remnants of the past. In a few thousand years, what will remain of our civilization? What stories will future peoples tell about us? Will they wonder about us the way we wonder about the Sumerians? Perhaps they'll find our buildings, our books, our digital archives, assuming anything survives that long. They'll read about our beliefs, our questions, our attempts to understand existence. And maybe they'll ask about us what we ask about the Sumerians. Were they right? Did they know something we've forgotten? Should we take their stories literally or metaphorically? The cycle continues. Each generation looks back at previous generations with a mixture of admiration and puzzlement. Each generation faces the same eternal questions. Each generation must find its own answers, tell its own stories, create its own meaning. The Anunnaki, in this light, are every generation's ancestors and teachers. They represent everyone who came before, everyone who contributed to the accumulated wisdom and culture we inherit. They're the sum total of human achievement, personified as divine beings, because that's how the Sumerians made sense of receiving so much from the past. When we honor the Anunnaki, we're honoring human potential. The potential to learn, to create, to transcend our limitations. The potential to be teachers ourselves, to pass on gifts to future generations. The potential to be part of something that lasts beyond our individual lives. That's sacred, whether supernatural beings are involved or not. That's worthy of temples and rituals and careful preservation. Not because gods demand it, but because it makes us better humans. Because it connects us to something larger. Because it reminds us that we matter, that what we do echoes in eternity, that we're part of an ongoing story that's far from over. So here, at the end of our journey through the mystery of the Anunnaki, we return to where we began, standing in the desert, looking up at the stars, asking questions without demanding answers, embracing the wonder of not knowing while still seeking to understand. The Sumerians stood here 5,000 years ago, in the cities they built, with the knowledge they claimed came from the Anunnaki. They looked up at these same stars and felt connected to something vast and meaningful. They told stories to their children, who told stories to their children, across generations, until eventually those stories reached us. And now we stand here, not physically perhaps, but in imagination and spirit. We've inherited their gift of wonder. We've received their questions along with their partial answers, and it's now our turn to do with that inheritance what we will. We can dismiss it as primitive superstition, file it away as solved mystery, and move on to other concerns. That's one choice. Or we can let it change us. Let it open our minds to possibilities beyond the purely material. Let it remind us that existence is stranger and more wonderful than our everyday assumptions allow. Let it connect us to the long human story of questioning, seeking, wondering. That's the choice I'd suggest. Not believing blindly in ancient astronauts or literal gods, but not dismissing too quickly either. Staying open, staying curious, staying connected to the part of us that looks at the stars and feels something, a longing, a recognition, a sense that there's more to reality than meets the eye. The Anunnaki, whatever they were or weren't, gave us that gift. The gift of the question, the gift of the mystery, the gift of wonder. And 5,000 years later, that gift still has power. The stars wheel overhead in their ancient dance. The desert wind whispers across sand that's forgotten more civilizations than we can imagine. And somewhere in the space between the infinite above and the finite below, between the ancient past and the uncertain future, between what we know and what we imagine, there we are, human, wandering, connected to everything that came before and everything that will come after, part of a story so vast we can't see its beginning or its end, but knowing somehow that we belong to it, that we matter, that our brief moment in the sun is linked to all the other moments, all the other lives, all the other questions asked under all the stars across all the ages. The Anunnaki, if they were listening, might smile at that. Or maybe they're not listening. Maybe they never were. Maybe they were never there at all. But the stars are still shining. The questions are still hanging in the night air. And we're still here, still human, still seeking, still wondering. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's everything. Sleep well, wandering soul. Dream of ancient cities and divine teachers. Dream of mysteries solved and mysteries deepened. Dream of connections across time and space, of gifts received and gifts given, of belonging to something eternal. The desert remembers. The stars witness. The story continues. And you are part of it all. Good night.